Yes, of course, please do. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
So this notion of effective teaching, I mean, I think one of the things which you have mentioned, which is really important to establish, is it's a complex and contested notion. The synopsis that you were presenting there seemed to me to be very one which is very much rooted in this kind of technicist interpretation of what effective teaching is. Now, if you look at, say, particular models which are well known within the literature on effective teaching, typically we might categorise them into the competent craftsperson, the reflective practitioner, and charismatic teacher.
Yeah.
Now, it strikes me that OFSTED's interpretation of the effective, or to use their language, outstanding teacher, is one which, by and large, falls into the first category, competent craftsperson. Now, the point I make about it being complex and contested is, if we compare that to other bodies that have an involvement within the sector, such as the IFL, and if you look at recent publications and work that they've been involved in, such as brilliant teachers within the lifelong learning sector, they have a much wider conceptualisation of what effective teaching is. And some of those criteria don't figure in OFSTED's interpretation. I'll give you some concrete examples of that. So they talk about the notion of the effective teacher being part of a community of practice, which touches on the point which you were moving towards, about sharing understanding of notions of teaching and learning, about having professional dialogues with people within their own institution. Now, I think one of the dangers of adopting a technicist model of effective teaching and learning is it's a bit like the old parable, you know, about you teach somebody, you give somebody a fish, and they don't go hungry for a day, but you teach somebody to fish, and then they'll never go hungry again. Well, this technicist model of effective teaching and learning, ones that are typically enshrouded in this kind of language of what are the toolkits that we need for outstanding teaching. These are very short-term, cross-sectional perspectives on what effective teaching and learning are. And they're not going to move the sector forward in any way at all. All they're going to do is they're going to respond to the performative demands of these isolated, snapshot, annual observations that take place within the sector. What they do, in fact, is, and people repeatedly say this across the sector, they encourage the often referred to showcase, all singing, all dancing lesson, which actually does not only does it not move on that individual's performance and competence as a practitioner, but more importantly, it doesn't move on the learning of the students in their classroom. So that's the first point. The other point you were making about the move from observers, from judges to coaches, I think is an important one, and one with which I agree. But I think we also need to take a step back and ask ourselves the question, well, why is there an emphasis on observers being judgment makers rather than coaches who are encouraging and nurturing the development of staff? Well, the reasons for that are quite simple, and that is the framework, the assessment framework, under which those observers are being asked to operate is one which has been imposed on them by external agencies like OFSTED. So when we look at it from an assessment perspective, those observers have no ownership of the 4-point scale. No ownership at all. It isn't theirs, they didn't devise it. And actually when we start to unpick real, live examples of observations carried out, people genuinely can't put the finger on what makes a grade 1 outstanding teacher. In recent research that I carried out with OFSTED inspectors myself, I've directly asked them this question. Typical responses that come up, the same buzzwords: inspirational, a passion, and enthusiasm. Now, I don't disagree with those terms. I don't disagree whatsoever. I think they're absolutely crucial qualities and ingredients to making effective teaching. But the real issue we have to address here is they do not lend themselves to a kind of measurability, the one in which is being imposed through the use of a 4-point scale.
Too subjective.
Not only are they too subjective, but they're inconsistent. Yeah? They're not. There's an unreliability to them. So they can. So when we hear about, and this is a very common thing across the sector again, when we hear about internal lesson observation grades, the reliability, the accuracy of those being called into question by OFSTED, the knee-jerk reaction of many colleges is to think, oh, we need to make it more robust, more rigorous. When actually, there's no conversation there about the subjective interpretation of those individuals who are actually making a judgment on the judgments of the people working within the colleges. And that's a conversation that needs to be happening. I don't think colleges should immediately think, okay, we need to listen to whatever advice it is that Ofsted are giving us in order to make sure our systems are more rigorous and robust. Because actually that's a fallacy. They're not rigorous and robust. When you start to unpick and examine the criteria, actually the criteria aren't there. They're not there in a measurable, transparent way.
But they never can be, because any criteria is, of course, up to me to put it into action and to interpret it, and so it is subjective. Any criteria is subjective. And it's the same for me marking, of course, somebody's homework or somebody's exam script. Our whole exam board system is subjective. Everything in life is subjective.
But that doesn't mean to say that you don't stop attempting to try and make them as transparent and as measurable as possible. The issue is they are presented as if they do have some kind of reliability and accuracy.
Well, going back to that, I have presented those bullet points in front of you, the key bullet points of the new framework. I've not heard anybody demolish those bullet points and say, that's rubbish, that shouldn't apply. So it is down to the interpretation, and I agree with you wholly, it is subjective. And I equally agree, and I'm trying to drive at this point, that outstanding is too elusive in terms of description. I used hairs in the back of the inspector's neck standing up, you said passion, enthusiasm, and so on. And I fully agree, it is too vague. It does not help the sector in the slightest. And so I would want to bring it down into concrete examples of what outstanding practice is. And I got the impression from your first few comments you might disagree with some of that, where you think this toolkit stuff can't work in that regard.
Well, they're contextually specific.
Yes,
I think that's important
but it's a starting point. It's a starting point.
Because, of course, one of the dangers of embracing a technicist toolkit philosophy is that you fail to attach significant importance to context.
Yes.
And if we know anything about learning, what research has told us over the last 3 decades in particular, learning is context specific.
Yep. Well, I wouldn't quibble with you, and certainly my diamond lesson plan that I push at training courses is not some fixed, narrow formula, but simply windows into good practice, and it's simply illustrating for you what good practice actually is.